Hello and welcome back to the second tutorial video looking at Unit 715, Strategic Approaches to Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And in this one we're going to have a look at Task 2. If you've somehow arrived here without having seen the first in the series, my name is Brent Warren and I'm the Training Director and one of the Senior Tutors at CMBD. Before we get into the detail of Task 2, it's a good idea just to kind of recap on what you covered in Task 1. Task 1 was all about identifying whether there were any issues in the organisation that we were examining, what approaches could possibly be taken to address some of those issues, the impact of those issues on the organisation achieving its strategic priorities, and finally we wrapped it up with a presentation, a business case, to a real or our imaginary senior management team. So one suggested way you can tackle Task 2 is that having made your report, you've now been asked to do something about it. This is really why this particular assignment is an excellent choice for somebody who's actually going to take responsibility for issues in this area, because you're going to produce a plan. The first thing I'd like to clarify is whether or not to do a report or a case study. If you check the assignment brief guidance notes for completion of Task 2, it gives you the option. If in Task 1 you delivered a report or presented to our real or imaginary senior management team, then it makes sense to continue on and write a report on how to implement the changes required. In other words, we're looking into the future. If, however, Task 1 was historical, in other words, looking back perhaps at your own organisation and the journey that it went on, or indeed another organisation that you've researched, then a case study approach about what happened is probably the way to go. So let's make a start at looking at Task 2 in detail, and we'll start with the assignment brief instructions. Now, if we look at that assignment brief, there's a bit of sort of general scene setting going on at the top, and I'll refer to a copy of it that I've got with me. It says that Task 2 has been designed to enable leaders to select and appraise data and information to inform the strategic priorities of an organisation. Leaders will also evidence their ability to embed strategic priorities for equality, diversity and inclusion within an organisation. And that overall statement is matched by the three parts of Task 2, 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. Let's take a quick look at page 2 of the assignment brief, where we have the word count allowance chart, and we can see that for those three subtasks we've got a total of 2,000 words. So somewhere around 650 to 700 words per AC. Now, when we look at those three ACs, they follow a pretty logical order, researching some information, interpreting it, deciding on priorities for action, and then implementing them. This becomes clearer still when we look at the syllabus, or the unit specification as it's referred to in the assignment brief. This is where we get the indicative content for each of the three questions in Task 2. You can probably see with the sheer amount of information in the assignment brief and the syllabus why I continually go on about having these documents to hand when you're attempting to answer an assignment task. A couple of other general instructions in the assignment brief in particular. Don't forget headings and subheadings. They are specifically asked for in both the report and case study formats. You were asked to provide evidence for the selection and appraisal of information and data in 2.1, and a little bit of thought may be required on how to do this. It does mention that you can write about it in the assignment brief, but it's probably going to require the use of the evidence booklet. Word count is obviously tight in this task, and I've previously suggested, and it also mentions in the assignment brief, that pasting in suitable diagrams or charts into the body of the assignment is acceptable. If you use a chart, for example, make sure it's a kind of screenshot so that it doesn't add on to your word count. But sometimes it's easier to paste more substantial things into the evidence booklet itself. When using the evidence booklet, make sure that your work is clearly referenced through from the assignment brief and vice versa. And bear in mind the 6-page limit on the size of the evidence booklet and the comments I've made previously about embedding files. We're not saying you can't do it, just talk to us on the best way because it can cause some problems. So on 2.1, there may be a variety of internal and or external sources of information and data. The indicative content for 2.1 and the syllabus gives a huge number of suggestions. But you will almost certainly have other good sources of information. It may be, for example, that you have historical and current data on the diversity of your workforce. And you may also have specific information on your marketplace or sector. Very important in this particular task to remember that you can't comment about all of them. So my suggestion is focusing on 3 or 4 of the most important and the most influential and talking about those with your limited word count. There is a command verb for 2.1 because it says select and appraise. And a quick look at the command verb definitions reminds us that to appraise is to look at and assess the value of something and form an opinion about whether it's useful. In this case, the sources of information and data that you chose, you need to have an opinion and justify why you chose those and perhaps not something else. Moving on now to 2.2, this is where we start to formulate our strategic priorities. It might well be that our information and data has thrown up a number of issues, but which are the most important ones? Also note from the indicative content in the syllabus that 2.2 is a 3-parter. The indicative content for 2.2 contains 3 bullet-pointed sections, and it makes sense to think about our subtitling and making it clear about what we're writing about to the assessor. There is a sneaky command verb in the first part of 2.2. When we look at that first paragraph, it tells us to critically assess. So in 2.2a, for want of a better way of putting it, we're asked to provide a reasoned judgment as to why we have chosen perhaps the 3 or 4 priorities that we want to address first. 2.2b is all about how we're going to monitor our progress. It talks about developing a framework for assessing results and ongoing monitoring. And finally, in 2.2c, if that's what we want to call it, we've got 3 tasks. We've got to talk about the impact that our chosen strategic priorities is going to have. We've got to talk about how we're going to embed this into the organisation. And we've also got to look at, what sort of policies might need reviewing and things like that. So far in task 2, we've talked about how we've identified things that we need to do. We've talked about how we prioritise them. So we move on to 2.3, which is how we're going to actually implement them. So looking at the indicative content for 2.3, this is another one which gives a wide range of suggested things that could happen. Now, as well as the suggested strategies in the indicative content, you may well have your own list of strategies. We can't write about everything, so I suggest you put the 2 lists together and again you pick out the 3 or 4 main strategies that you want to go into in a reasonable amount of detail. So to summarise 2.3, this is the how. Okay, that pretty much brings me to the end of my sort of advice and guidance for 7.1.5, Strategic Approaches to Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. The views I've expressed are a personal opinion based on helping people and marking assignments over the years. I'm not saying they're absolutely right and should be followed to the letter. All I've tried to do is suggest some approaches which may be beneficial. So it just remains for me to say good luck with your assignment. Keep in touch with your tutor if you're doing your qualification with CMBD, and thank you for listening.